So we're going to be talking today about the research we've done as part of this project, looking at the role of American cities within the U.S.-China relationship and the very contested position that they have found themselves in. In order to start our conversation, let me step back for a second and say a word about sort of subnational U.S.-China ties more broadly before we dive into cities specifically. When we're talking about subnational U.S.-China relations, we're talking about state and local level ties with China, governmental as well as civil society and business ties, academic ties fall within the scope of this research as well. For the last several decades, subnational relations have been a key part of the bigger U.S.-China relationship, but they've often been in the background, and they've generally been seen as pretty non-controversial. Contacts between business organizations in China, local governments, sister city relationships, educational and cultural exchanges. What we've seen, though, in the last 5 years or more has been some of what had been in the background coming into the foreground as this part of the relationship becomes more visible and I think also more heavily contentious. So we've seen, on the one hand, securitization of areas of the subnational relationship that previously were not seen as highly politicized or highly, security relevant areas. Things like sister cities now are viewed by many through a national security lens. We've also seen subnational actors play a more prominent role in sort of international diplomacy as the U.S.-China relationship gets more strained. So we can think of the example of Governor Newsom's visit to Beijing last year to meeting with Xi Jinping, paving the way in some sense for the Biden-Xi summit that occurred in California last year. On the other extreme, we see also a lot of state level and local level actors now going beyond what Washington is doing in terms of trying to combat perceived threats from China, including perceived local interference or infiltration of the Communist Party. So Ron DeSantis in Florida has obviously been leading a crusade along with his attorney general along this front to try to purge, I think, a lot of ties to China in the state of Florida. And we've seen that elsewhere. So one thing I just want to highlight also from the broader academic research project that Sarah and I are working on that focuses more at the state level of the U.S.-China relationship is that we've seen a lot of variation both over time and across states in the last several years. There's been an overall shift toward more confrontational action by state and local actors and less cooperative engagement with China at the state level. But we've also seen a lot of variation across different parts of the country, different states that have positioned themselves very differently. And I think at this point, it becomes really important to dwell down beneath the state level to really the local level, the city level and the metropolitan scale, which is where we're focusing this research, because we find even more variation, right? And also even more kind of intensive challenges when we look at the city level. So the starting point for this work is the idea that cities are both really important places and also very important players in the U.S.-China relationship at present. Cities are where a lot of the economic institutions and infrastructure that have been sites of interaction between the U.S. and China are based, whether we're thinking about major ports like the Port of Los Angeles and Long Beach, whether we're thinking about diplomatic infrastructure like the PRC's consulates in several U.S. cities, whether we're thinking about major universities, business headquarters, production facilities. Also, when we think about the human piece of this, right, the diaspora communities and the sites of social and cultural contact between the U.S. and China, cities are where a lot of this is happening. Cities also increasingly have been a lot of the actors on the front lines of this relationship, particularly as national level diplomacy gets strained. Mayors and other local actors are fielding more outreach from PRC diplomats. We're also seeing, the importance of local relationships in navigating the more difficult period in the larger U.S.-China relationship. So this leads to some of the goals that have motivated our work with the Truman Center over the past year. We've really sought to understand how this rapidly changing situation of the larger U.S.-China relationship is being felt at the local level, what impacts and challenges it's creating for cities, and how cities in turn are recognizing and navigating these challenges. We're also trying to understand, in a way that's relevant for policymakers, what can be done to minimize the risks that go with subnational engagement between the U.S. and China and how to maximize some of the benefits that are still possible. Our goal in this work, and I think something that makes this work distinctive, is that we're really trying to take seriously both the benefits and the risks of subnational engagement. There's been a certain amount of work that's been done from a national security vantage point that focuses heavily on the vulnerabilities that state and local engagement with China can create. On the flip side, right, there's work on the educational or academic side or cultural engagement side that focuses really heavily on the benefits. We're trying as best as we're able to put these two sides together into one bigger narrative or one bigger picture of what's going on and to try to understand these in a balanced way. We're also really trying in this work to capture a wide array of different geographic experiences and different types of local voices and perspectives And we're hoping that this leads to some policy-relevant insights and recommendations. So I'll hand off to Sarah.
Thanks, Kyle. So we're grateful to the Truman Center for giving us an opportunity to really do a deep dive this year into city-level engagement with China. We've spent time in 4 cities across the U.S., deliberately selected to represent a kind of range of city experiences in a variety of ways. So we did interviews and in some cases closed-door roundtable discussions with key interlocutors in Los Angeles, Des Moines, Iowa, Jacksonville, Florida, and Hartford, Connecticut. We were trying in all cases to speak to folks from the civil society sector, from universities, local government, the business sector, in some cases sister city or sister state partnerships, in general trying to understand the sort of range of actors who maybe were engaging with China in the past and how their interactions have changed in the future. And this was also kind of informed by research that we've done across a variety of other US cities and states with less of an intensive focus on those other cities than on these 4. So I want to talk briefly about some of the major impacts on cities of changes in the US-China relationship more broadly. One of the findings that has been largely consistent, I would say, across these 4 cities, despite the significant differences between them, is that city-level engagement with China has dramatically declined. For decades, there was, as Kyle mentioned before, kind of normalized low-level engagement, person-to-person, educational, and economic, across a range of cities. In many cases, this largely stopped with the pandemic and did not resume afterwards. There's some variation. So in Los Angeles, the ties to China have remained more intact than they have in other places. But even in Los Angeles, there have been dramatic effects of the pandemic. Since 2023, I think Chinese local government actors have gotten the message from the central government that they should be looking to revive ties and have been actively reaching out to cities and to universities, among others, to try to rebuild those ties. But in general, they're finding that there are a few people on the US side who are willing to pick up the phone. And some of this is due to perceived domestic political risks that people recognize that the sort of mood in the US is very anti-China right now, and they're worried about domestic political blowback if they even take a meeting with Chinese actors. There also has been a lot of outreach from the FBI to local actors that is, I think, creating a chilling effect where people are not taking meetings with Chinese partners, in part because they don't want to have to engage around those meetings with the FBI. And the practical challenges of interaction with the PRC have really increased dramatically. So on a practical level, flights between the US and China are down dramatically from what they were before. That's really hindered things like travel, tourism, person-to-person engagement. There's also, I think, a lot of uncertainty within China about what's permitted and what the political environment is going to look like moving forward under Xi Jinping, who is quite a repressive president. And so I think Chinese actors are moving more cautiously. And also, obviously, those changes in China have created new challenges and new reluctance to engage with China on the part of US actors. But one of the things that has really come through as a crucial point of our research is that although there are real risks and downsides to engaging with China, cities also are feeling significant losses as a result of this complete or near complete decline in ties to China. Those losses are in the realm of education, in terms of cities' ability to meet their basic economic development and infrastructure goals, and in terms of things like person-to-person ties that people saw as really valuable and now feel like they can't resume, in part because of the domestic political environment within the United States. So to try to capture some of the perspectives of our participants, we want to highlight the voices of 3 people who participated in our interviews or roundtables across 3 of our settings. And many of our interviewees were not willing to speak in anything other than an anonymized way. And so these voices are not necessarily representative, but I think they all sort of highlight important components of what we were hearing from our interviewees. We're not presenting these because we necessarily are endorsing or agreeing with everything that they're saying, but we thought it was important to bring some of these local voices into the conversation. So the first clip I'm going to play is from Kim Heidemann, who has decades of experience as a citizen diplomat working with Chinese partners, among others, in Iowa.
National relations for nearly 20 years in the state of Iowa. And what I have found is that when you get rid of the subnational level, you get rid of the people element. It is the volunteers, I find, that have the passion and they have the time and the talent to give to really make these relationships more meaningful, really about trust, honesty, genuineness, and cultural exchange. And frankly, I think that not only would it be a shame for them to go away, but I think they should actually be enhanced.
Our second clip is from Wei Zhou, who is a local AAPI activist in Florida, former president of the Jacksonville Chinese Association and a board member of the Florida Asian American Justice Alliance, which is one of the organizations that has been fighting Florida's land ban law, which has made it illegal for Chinese citizens to buy real estate in much of the state of Florida.
The Chinese community today is suffering codified discrimination by the Florida government after the unconstitutional Florida Land Law, SB 264, and the Education Law, SB 846, were passed. The Land Law prohibits Chinese citizens from purchasing real properties on the Florida soil. And the Education Law restricts Chinese international students from being employed as graduate research assistants. Many Chinese citizens living in Florida worry about buying a home for their family, and lots of Chinese students were denied admission to graduate programs due to the education law. The China Initiative, which was ended 2 years ago, still has a strong influence today. I've talked to some Chinese American college professors here in Florida, and they still do not feel fully trusted by their universities today.
And our final clip is from Jeff Wasserstrom, Chancellor's Professor of History at the University of California, Irvine, and a historian of modern China.
There are lots of challenges to getting academic exchanges, including the flow of students from the United States into the PRC, back to the kind of level they were in the 2010s, because COVID dramatically interrupted some trends. But there are other problems unrelated to COVID that are contributing to this, including a sense that under Xi Jinping, for the last dozen years or so, things have been tightening in many different regards, and there's just less certainty about what will be a taboo topic at one point or another.
So responding to some of the challenges that these actors are describing and just the changes that Sarah has discussed, we also sought to understand from local stakeholders in these cities, so local government leaders, business leaders, university leaders, community organizations, how they are trying to make sense of the current moment and how they're trying to navigate it. So there are some trends that we want to highlight. These are not necessarily present in all cities. I mean, one of the main findings that's emerged from all the work that we've done on subnational U.S.-China relations is that there's an enormous amount of local diversity. It's very hard to generalize from one state or city to another. But we are seeing in a number of cases that cities are not just reducing the amount of engagement with China, but narrowing the scope, right? And being more deliberate about focusing on areas of engagement that they perceive as fairly high value for the local economy or local society, as well as fairly low risk. So these include areas like export promotion and tourism promotion, areas like educational exchange, particularly at the university level, right? Trying to reinstate opportunities for study abroad, trying to bring more Chinese students back from China after COVID disruption, or trying to maintain levels of Chinese international students in a lot of fields, even if it's getting harder in some fields such as STEM. And certainly in the case of California, and also in the case of Des Moines, Iowa, and some other cities, there's been real interest also in making sure that discussions and some kinds of limited cooperation around climate action continue at the city level, because this is, of course, seen as an existential issue by a number of cities and local leaders across the U.S. We're seeing in some cases also a kind of quiet paradiplomacy that maintains some of these ties with China, but tries to move them out of the spotlight. So in many cases, it's just so politically toxic to be seen, shaking hands with a Chinese diplomat in front of a Chinese flag, that people are still, hoping for substantive conversations, but they're trying to do it in settings that are much, much less visible to the public. I think there are both understandable and good things about that, but there are also concerns about kind of less public visibility and accountability that can surround interactions that take place in private. We see across the board, as I'll talk about more in a second, growing risk awareness from local actors about both security and political concerns related to interactions with China. We also see, kind of connected with that, more intergovernmental consultation between local actors at the city level and also at the state level with federal officials, sometimes initiated by local leaders themselves. Some mayors, have proactively reached out to the State Department for guidance on how to engage with China. In other cases, they're approached by the FBI or they're approached by the State Department when there are high-profile sort of international exchanges happening. But this kind of communication is good. However, one of our findings is that there's still a lot of scope for improving it, both in kind of quality and quantity. Something that we are glad to see is happening in a number of these cities are efforts by different types of local leaders to call out and combat the forms of anti-Asian hate that have gotten really severe over the past several years and that could become more severe again. And more generally to also call out not just rhetoric, right, but discriminatory policies, such as what are increasingly a large number of bills being passed by state legislatures across the country. That still has left a lot of AAPI communities feeling extremely vulnerable in many settings, but it has been a huge boon for activists in these communities when they hear some support from local institutions as well. So when local government, when universities, other powerful institutional actors are also using some of their voice and weight to weigh in on these issues and to increase visibility, that is something that has been really appreciated by some of the community groups that we've talked to. So the big kind of elephant that I think is looming in the room, especially when we're in DC talking about this subject, is the question of how well localities are balancing sort of the risks, or the perceived risks at least, of this kind of engagement with the rewards. And we want to be clear that there are a lot of documented challenges that have surrounded subnational exchange in the past, right? I think many of us are probably too aware of them if we've been reading the news in the last couple of years. There are documented cases of political interference in U.S. state and local politics, right, from actors who represent the PRC party state. There have been really upsetting cases of transnational repression on U.S. soil, on college campuses and cities. There have been espionage activities, right, economic as well as political and military security espionage. And so these remain challenges to manage. Also, it's clear that local actors in the U.S. federal system oversee a lot of crucial infrastructure when it comes to communications infrastructure, when it comes to pipelines, utility infrastructure. A lot of this is regulated in the first instance by states and even by cities and local actors. So not all of these forms of infrastructure are well guarded, and there's still a lot more that needs to be done. But we strongly disagree at this point, or at least I strongly disagree with the idea that states and localities should be seen as a kind of soft underbelly, which is a trope that comes up a lot in talking about cities and states in the U.S.-China relationship. I don't think this metaphor is right today, if it ever was. It implies that there's both a kind of special degree of vulnerability at the local level, as well as a lack of guarding of these assets. And I don't think either of those is correct. We're well aware right now at the national level of huge security risks to nationally regulated forms of infrastructure like the telecom system. We're aware of cyber threats that are still not fully remediated in the U.S., because there hasn't been adequate action by companies or by the federal government. Now, some of these risks also very much exist at the local level, but they're not unique to the local level. We also have found through our research that there's been a dramatic change in how aware local actors are of these risks, both because there has been a lot of outreach and a lot of messaging in the media and in Washington, D.C. about the kinds of risks surrounding interaction with China, and also because there's been significant regulatory tightening of interactions between the U.S. and China in different channels. The State Department is doing a lot more to keep track of subnational delegation visits from China to the U.S. There are more stringent rules overseeing Chinese foreign direct investment through the FIRMA expanded powers of CFIUS. Universities, as university employees, we know this, are now subject to vastly more disclosure requirements and many more restrictions about interactions, gift-taking from China than they were in the past. So on the whole, risks remain, but if anything, we now think the pendulum has swung in the other direction, where many states and cities, not all necessarily, but many are now overcorrecting, and they're actually cutting off low-risk forms of interaction that might have substantial benefits because they're not afraid just of the underlying security risks, but also of the political backlash that goes with these kinds of challenges.
We want to end by talking a little bit about some recommendations, both for actors at the federal level and those at the city and state level. And one of the things that I think has become really clear is that there is a need for greater guidance and coordination between the city, state, and federal levels in terms of China engagement. The State Department's Office of, or Subnational Diplomacy Unit has played an important role in starting to do some of this coordination and giving cities and states guidance about engagement with China. And we think that's an important kind of avenue of communication and knowledge building that needs to be, sort of expanded and continued. Another idea that my Truman colleague Max Boucher has written about is the idea of a subnational diplomacy innovation fund, a kind of a fund that would bring together resources from philanthropy, the private sector, and government to enable localities to pursue smart approaches to subnational engagement, and importantly, that would allow them to do so without relying on funding from foreign partners. I think one of the challenges for subnational engagement with China is that often U.S. cities do not have their own resources to bring to this relationship, whereas Chinese partners do. But obviously there are some risks in terms of accepting Chinese government funding, and something like an innovation fund might allow cities to think more strategically and autonomously about what their own priorities are. And more generally, we think there need to be more user-friendly, more accessible platforms for cities to learn about best practices around engaging with China and learn about some of the risks that other cities have encountered. Right now, a lot of that information sharing is quite ad hoc. So for instance, if cities encounter pushback on engaging with Taiwan, they might share information on how they address that with another city in their state if they already have personal relationships. But getting that message out more broadly to a wider range of cities is something that needs to be enabled by information sharing platforms, websites, or other kind of venues that city employees can easily access. On the city side, we think it's important for cities to think carefully about their own goals of engagement and to sort of set an agenda autonomously from what Chinese partners are offering. So to think about whether the value to their community would be cultural offerings through some kind of cultural exchange program, whether they have specific economic goals, but set kind of narrow terms of engagement and then really insist that those are the terms that are followed. This could include things like thinking about insisting that they will engage with both Taiwanese and Chinese partners and refusing to sort of bow to requests from the Chinese side that they cancel agreements with Taiwanese partners. Finally, we think that it's important to not allow one or two voices to represent themselves as the kind of monopoly representative of the local Chinese heritage community. We've seen in cases like the Linda Sun indictment or the role that Winnie Greco seems to have played with Mayor Eric Adams, that in some cases local officials are very vulnerable when they allow one person to claim to represent the whole Chinese community. If that person becomes a tool of CCP influence, that can be really dangerous, and they can play a role in sort of preventing officials, local officials, from meeting with other voices. So expanding the range of voices in the room, listening to multiple perspectives from within the Chinese heritage community, meeting with folks who are Taiwanese and Chinese, we think that these are all really important for officials at the local level.
So I'd like to start off the discussion with sort of a first order question for Kyle. And just kind of going to the basics, why should we even care about subnational engagement between the United States and China? Why is it important? Can you talk about how subnational engagement has benefited U.S. interests, whether we're talking about sort of high-level diplomatic interests or business interests or the interests of average Americans?
Thanks. So I think there are, first of all, kind of two tracks that we want to think about this along, right? So one is the question of benefits to local communities, cities, their communities, regions of the country. Then there's the question of how this is useful for kind of national level interests. And I think that, whether it's national security as understood in DC, whether it's other sort of broader, more encompassing concerns of the U.S., to start with the sort of former, the benefits, the concrete benefits, excuse me, for localities. There are very dense economic ties between a lot of U.S. states and cities in China, right? So Los Angeles is an extreme case, but it's also, I think, telling about just how dense the interdependence, and it's not one-way dependence, right, but the interdependence of U.S. state and local economies and Chinese, actors have been in recent years. So, if you're home to the port of LA and Long Beach, right? That drives a massive part of the local economy in LA, and the vast majority of that, or a significant share of that, maritime trade that's happening is with partners in East Asia and China in particular. So these transportation and trade links are really anchored in many cities. More generally, until recently, China had been a significant source of FDI for a number of localities. That has definitely faded out, and many local communities no longer feel that this is worth the political backlash to pursue. But during the brief period when this did occur, there were a number of cities that saw quite successful, business investments, many of which are still doing fine today, even in a climate where there's been much more scrutiny. Educational links are very important between the U.S. and China, both the opportunities for college students from the U.S. excuse me, to travel back and forth, and also the huge impact of both economically, intellectually, and culturally of having large numbers of students from Asia coming to the U.S. Right, many from China. This is crucial to local economies, right? But it's also crucial to having a sort of academic and scientific lead in the U.S. We've relied really heavily on talented researchers coming from China to power research in our universities and other institutions in our companies. And without this, right, this would strand a lot of research endeavors. And the final piece, for localities is just broadening these cultural and human links. Like, this is seen as an important priority for a lot of local leaders. I was actually surprised by how significantly this resonated with many mayors and local community leaders who really want their cities to have global ties and who want their communities, which represent the whole globe, to feel they are able to connect and maintain links around the world. And just very briefly turning to the second point. So I think there are really important local benefits to this when it works well, right, when it's properly conducted. And servicing these economic and educational relationships requires dialogue and visits back and forth. At the national level, though, this is helpful because it broadens the sort of aperture for communication with China, particularly at a time when federal conversations can grind to a halt or can get highly politicized. This offers different ways, obviously, for China to talk to the U.S., but also for the U.S. to talk to China. And that's very much a two-way street if we use it correctly, right? If it's not used correctly, then it could be used more effectively by China. But if we are systematic about this, it can help advance U.S. diplomatic goals broadly. And I think more generally at the national level too, the sort of scaling up of these economic effects across many cities. No one city's economic needs, like Los Angeles' economic needs, should not be driving U.S. foreign policy. But across the board, if various cities are suffering because their economies depend on these kinds of linkages and the maintaining of these relationships, that starts to have a real dragging effect on the national economy. And I'm afraid that we're going to see that in the next 4 years as we see imposition of even more restrictions on trade and investment. This is going to really bite for a lot of local economies in ways that people haven't yet begun to realize broadly, right? That many companies are going to have huge supply chain issues. Many aspects of the U.S. science and technology research enterprise are going to be inhibited. So there are a lot of consequences.
Great. Well, Sarah, I want to sort of ask you the flip side of that question. Can your study found that there are many reasons why subnational engagement has declined due to the pandemic, some overcorrection due to the political climate, and so on. So what did you find, and maybe some specific examples of how this decline has challenged local and subnational level interests? What are some of the challenges that local businesses or cities have encountered as a result?
Sure. I think there are a lot of examples that came up, some of them as a result of changes in federal policy and others as a result of kind of fears around the political toxicity of engaging with China. So one concrete example, two of the cities that we looked at were port cities, Jacksonville and LA. And there are new restrictions on using Chinese-produced ship-to-shore cranes at U.S. ports. The challenge is that these cranes are not produced in the U.S., and overwhelmingly, like 80% are produced by one company in China. And so while there are perhaps real security risks to the use of these Chinese ship-to-shore cranes and concerns about what kind of information technology is embedded in them, there's no real viable alternative at this point. And so cities are struggling with what that means for their ability to operate the port that's an essential part of their own economy. I think another example is that in multiple cases that we talked to, cities see Chinese foreign direct investment within particular parameters as valuable for their local economy. In some cases, these FDI projects bring 100% union jobs to the local area. They've been perceived as good actors within the local economy. And yet, because of the anti-China political mood and the concern about domestic political backlash, economic development officers and others feel like they can't even take a meeting about Chinese FDI or engage with potential investors because it just is so politically risky for them to do so.
Turning to Mary. So Mary, earlier this year, you wrote a great essay on how the US and China seem to be decoupling, not just economically or strategically, but the populations also seem to be decoupling, especially when it comes to academic exchanges. And so I was wondering if you could just sort of tell us how the academic exchange landscape has evolved over the years and what you see as some of the short to long-term consequences of the decline in exchanges.
So similarly to what Kyle and Sarah were talking about with people-to-people exchanges in states and cities, I think academic exchanges have gone through a very similar process of kind of an increase in risk. So there has been, I think, more attention to problems with academic exchange and risk. Also a perception of risk, like that it's just more dangerous to do something. So there's risk, and then there's like the perception of risk, which is maybe even exaggerated. And that gets to this sort of then an overcorrection that you also mentioned in one of your last slides about how at the administration level of universities, there's an overcorrection, right, to address these risks. But going, I think, as far as possible to reduce any perception of risk, which includes things like, every time you fill out a grant form, you have to say that you don't participate in a foreign talent program. I recently had to approve something where it was a joint conference, and it said that we couldn't spend any money we couldn't give any money to the Chinese side and I wondered why that was the case, why we can't, these restrictions that seem overly restrictive. That leads to a third impact, which is that individual faculty, individual administrators, individual students, we restrain ourselves. It's almost like what happens with self-censorship is that when you don't know what the line is, right? That this is a line about censorship in China, you don't know where the line is, and so you kind of overcorrect and you self-censor yourself even more than is necessary. And I think that's what you also see in the United States with universities, is that there's this self-restraint. So I was recently talking to somebody in computer science, and he said, I don't do anything with Chinese colleagues anymore. I don't do anything with Chinese students anymore because the risk is too great. And so I think that's the most, that kind of knockdown effect where you have this increase in risk, and then you have an overcorrection on the part of the bureaucracy, and then you have self-restraint on the part of the people who are directly involved. And so the impact on academic exchange has been really severe. There's also, I think, something important that bears pointing out around people-to-people exchanges in general. I just happened to see in the headlines today that the House Select Committee on China has called out Washington, D.C. and the mayor for still having a sister city relationship with Beijing and saying that relationship should end. It's like, I don't know, maybe it should end. But of course, in the same day, President-elect Trump invited Xi Jinping to come to the inauguration. And so there seems to be this kind of maybe unfairness or hypocrisy when it comes to people exchanges, that they're easier to cancel. And I think they're easier to cancel because they are low risk, and they're also if that gets canceled, it will, it's not going to affect national security either way, that we have a sister city relationship. But it's a very public demonstration of how the U.S. government feels about the Chinese government, but it's very low risk, right? There's nothing about it that is going to impact the U.S. economy in any big way. But at the other China. And so I think, again, the constant refrain here among policymakers in D.C. is that it's about the Chinese Communist Party. It's not about the Chinese people. And yet when we go after these people-to-people exchanges, which are actually kind of low risk, I think we make the point, really, it is about the Chinese people. And I think that's a mistake.
That's very insightful. Turning from the academic to the business community, Kyle, in recent years, as you all mentioned, we've talked about Chinese FDI, and there's sort of this growing risk perceptions about what Chinese investment means. And I'm curious, as you've engaged with different cities across the U.S., you've talked a bit about Los Angeles. Did you find sort of big disparities in how different communities view Chinese investment? And what would you say accounts for these disparities?
Yeah, there are big disparities at the city level, at the state level, in sort of attitudes right now toward Chinese FDI. So it's worth saying that part of this is kind of less of an issue than it might be otherwise, because it's so much harder to move capital out of China right now that there aren't that many businesses, in many cases, actively moving capital out and looking for opportunities in the U.S. as there might have been 10 years ago. But there certainly are still, very commercially viable projects. And we see this maybe I'll also defer to Mary to weigh in on this, but particularly when it comes to the EV sector and clean tech, right? This is an area where, whether we love it or hate it, Beijing just has massive control over key parts of supply chains, and we're not going to be able to develop certain kinds of industries competitively in the U.S., at least in the near term, without choosing to interact with Chinese partners in whatever form that takes. So there is, by and large, a significant decline in kind of interest in Chinese FDI, both because the sort of supply of it has decreased, but also because communities are demanding and interested in a lot less of it. We are finding in places like Los Angeles, unsurprisingly, or greater LA, there's still more openness to considering this on a kind of project-by-project basis, and to looking at whether there are good opportunities. And there are certainly a lot of gaps that have emerged post-COVID as some of this investment has dried up. There have also been some spectacularly bad failures of investment, particularly in the real estate sector in LA, that have left a very bad taste in people's mouth, and those are something that has to be acknowledged as well, right? You have the ocean-wide sort of towers development project sitting in downtown LA, right opposite the convention center, and these are two 40-story tall buildings that are now empty and covered in graffiti. They have a certain kind of art value at this point, or cachet, but they have become a huge blemish basically on the LA landscape, and that's also created a lot of skepticism about real estate investment in particular. But in other parts of the country, we found, especially in the Midwest, closer to where I am based now, there are states and local governments who are just not looking at China. They may say that they're sort of giving it a look, but they've actually decided actively no longer to offer economic incentives from the state or to really engage proactively at all with would-be Chinese investors, mostly because they're afraid of the political backlash around this, and because of just general uncertainty about how big the actual security risks are. We've talked to a whole range of experts, from local business leaders, but also to national security experts, folks within law enforcement. And the thing is that it's very hard to pin down how significant these real risks are, and it's always hard to prove a negative. It's hard to say that they're risk-free. But we've seen very little evidence or heard of very few, if any, cases where physical investments in sort of manufacturing type businesses, or certainly when it comes to sort of restaurants or service industry investments, have actually generated credible security threats to the U.S. in the sense of threats to critical infrastructure or major espionage threats. But there's this assumption that more business investment by China would create a kind of front behind which malign actors could operate, there may be some validity to that, but the question that raises is why go this costly route of building factories when there's already so much access to so many different parts of the U.S., and there's already so much access via cyber channels. So even though the security risks objectively seem to be pretty limited, there's so much hesitancy for the reasons that Mary was talking about a second ago.
Mary, did you have any thoughts about FDI? And I know you.
So one of the things that we see in the Midwest is a debate about, and it's not just in the Midwest, actually, it's all over, whether or not Chinese investment should be allowed into these critical industries like electric vehicles, particularly for battery production. And that's been a big issue in the state of Michigan over the CATL licensing agreement with Ford and Marshall, and then also Goshen in Big Rapids. And my sense is that again, and there's been calls by policymakers that for these investments to end. As far as I can tell, they're going forward. I was on a train from South Bend to Ann Arbor. There is a train, it's very interesting, and you pass by Marshall, Michigan, and the Ford plant is going up. It's not open yet, but it's clearly on its way. And there are good reasons, strategic reasons for the U.S. to want Chinese investment in this sector, because it'll bring down the cost of electric vehicles significantly Chinese battery technology is used. And so it's a great agreement for Ford to license technology and to build the plant here. And the arguments that I've heard against it are very vague arguments about Chinese communism coming in, or increasing our dependency, or stealing intellectual property. And when you think about each one of those, arguments, it's very hard for me to see that these are really reasonable arguments to make. And so there's a lot of scaremongering and fear-mongering, particularly among the local communities there. But it's very hard to justify, I think, that the U.S. can completely restrict these investments, of course, and that's why these investments are going forward. I was going to say one thing, kind of just as a recommendation. I think there has to be people, whether it's at universities or in corporations or in civil society, making the strategic argument for why we might want these things from China, because they improve the United States in a longer term, with a kind of longer term viewpoint, and looking at like the risks, the concrete risks, and evaluating them, rather than just these sort of abstract, vague arguments about getting everything that has to do with China out of the United States.
Sarah, turning to the issue of Taiwan, which came up in your presentation as sort of often a friction point when it comes to subnational engagement. Can you tell us more about how sort of Taiwan has featured in some of the cities that you studied? What were the friction points, and how did the cities deal with this Taiwan issue? And are they able to maintain links both to China and Taiwan, and why does this matter?
Yeah, there's a lot of subnational engagement with Taiwan across the U.S. This is an area where the Taiwanese government, I think, has been very active at both pursuing sort of traditional forms of subnational engagement, like sister city relationships, but also finding new ways of engaging with city and state policymakers. And unsurprisingly, this is an area where the PRC, like basically every other area, tries to isolate Taiwan and tries to threaten or perhaps punish local partners for engagement. One of the things that I think is important for cities to understand is that I would say a best practice, what's done in the cities with the largest and most professionalized international affairs staff, is that they engage with both Chinese and Taiwanese actors, and they just say no when they're requested, they receive a request from the Chinese consulate to uninvite like a Taiwanese partner, right? Or leave them off the bus to go to some particular event. They just say, no, you're both invited. You can make the choice not to come if you want to. And there have been some cases overseas where, Chinese partners have sort of pushed back hard on this. And so Chinese sister city agreement with Prague, for instance, was canceled after Prague signed an agreement with Taipei. But in general, I think there actually is room for engagement with both sides. And I think it's something that is an important way that cities can kind of normalize engagement with Taiwan, to say we have these local level partnerships with a sister city in China, for instance, but we are also going to continue to engage on the Taiwanese side as well. I'll also say that, subnational engagement with Taiwan is an area that I think has, there's a lot of excitement and energy around that at the city and state level right now, in part in the wake of things like the TSMC investment in Arizona, where there's, I think, cities and states are realizing that there are tremendous economic opportunities and other opportunities represented by engagement with Taiwan. And so there's been an increase in the last 6 years or so in the efforts of localities in the US to build and strengthen relationships with Taiwan.
That's great. Well, Sarah just laid out the case why it's important to proactively set the terms of engagement with Chinese partners to deter attempts at inappropriate influence. And I'm sure that's something that schools are thinking about as well. And so, Mary, I was wondering if you could talk to us about sort of how have academic institutions, American ones, sort of dealt with Chinese attempts to overreach, and how, challenges to academic freedom as well as student safety. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I think there are two main risks with academic engagement with China. The one that I think the U.S. government, for good reason, is the most worried about, which is research security around things in STEM, in science and technology. And then the second concern, I think, which is more of our concern, being social scientists who study China, is are we educating the next generation of experts who will speak the Chinese language, understand China, go to China and study abroad? And those two risks are they're just different. And on the research security side, with the concerns of the U.S. government, there's been, as I was saying earlier, just a huge increase in oversight by American universities because of the federal government's interest in this issue, and like that's led to, like I said, a lot of overcorrection and self-restraint, so that research collaboration between Chinese universities and American universities has gone down very rapidly, and the number of Chinese students coming to the United States is also decreasing, although less rapidly, I think, than people expected. There was an article in the New York Times yesterday on what might happen in the next administration, and that some universities are advising that students come back from break quickly so that they don't get left overseas if there's some kind of visa ban, as it happened in the first Trump administration over some Muslim majority countries. But that article also said that there's some talk of banning Chinese and Indian students, which completely shocked me. I mean, it was just a line in the article with no reference to why that would happen, but that would be 54% of the more than 1 million international students currently in the United States. So that would be a significant overcorrection because of these concerns over national security. On other things that have to do more with sort of academic freedom and the things that social scientists are worried about, and putting a lot of constraints on us to go to China or to do work around China and maybe not get a security clearance if we were to go into the government. That's a longer term problem, and I don't think we've really figured out how can we manage these STEM side security risks, but at the same time make sure that there is academic engagement with China and continuing to have American students going to China and Chinese students coming here.
Mm-hmm. What about Chinese students that are here in the U.S., so protecting their academic freedoms? Because there's been a lot of high-profile stories about Chinese consulates or organizations sort of scrutinizing what Chinese students who are studying abroad here in the U.S. are saying or doing. And so has your school sort of dealt with that issue at all?
I think that this whole issue of sort of transnational repression is very, very difficult for American universities to deal with. And I think for a long time it wasn't really on their radar screen, because it was mostly happening amongst Chinese students, or it was happening to Chinese students when they would return back to China, or it would happen to their families while they were in China if they had done something on social media or something. And I think only in the last few years have you seen American universities try to pay more attention to that. But it's not an easy issue for American universities to do systematically in terms of policy, because so much of it is happening. Sometimes it's happening actually on the campuses, but how it happens is often very invisible to the administrators, and it might even be invisible to faculty members. So, I don't know what Kyle and Sarah do, but for example, sometimes when I teach a sensitive topic and I have a lot of Chinese students in the room, I might say, let's have a hybrid meeting, and you can be on Zoom and there's no name, and you can participate more anonymously. And so not putting Chinese students at risk for them to say something that might be reported back by another student.
I would just add that I think this has been a particular challenge at universities that have really large concentrations of international students who don't always interact as much with the rest of the local community. So I think in general, it's a good practice to really integrate international students into the life of a university, and as much as possible into the life of the surrounding city or community, right? That's both the whole point of having people travel internationally to acquire language skills, to have contact with people outside their normal orbit. And it also, I think, helps do a lot to dampen some of these concerns, because I think one of the reasons this has been a hard issue to deal with is when it unfolds within large communities of Chinese American students or Chinese national students on U.S. campuses, the visibility into that is often pretty limited too. And there's also concern increasingly that kind of complaints about this can also be kind of reverse weaponized, that people can accuse classmates of coming after them, in ways that might be inappropriate to settle other scores. And so these issues can get incredibly complicated to unravel for administrators. And so I think it just there was a rush, clearly, as we've described more broadly. During the early 21st century, there was a rush to do as much business of all kinds with China as possible, and there wasn't always careful thought about how that was structured. And I think we've learned from some of those mistakes, and I don't think that we have the same mentality of the academic gold rush to bring in international students as prevalent anymore. But this is a good moment to pause and think about how best to structure it so that when students come here, they actually get a meaningful experience of being here. They enrich the lives of their American classmates and vice versa. And also so they're given much clearer understanding of what the norms and expectations of university communities are. I think that there's scope to do more in that domain.
I want to pose one last question, perhaps to Sarah, but I would invite either Mary or Kyle to weigh in as well. Your study points out that there's a direct connection between anti-China policies, reduced subnational engagement, and discrimination of AAPI communities. And so can you tell us a bit more about what you found on this issue, and can you highlight some of the best practices that you found, whether at the state or the local levels, for combating this serious problem?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, in some ways, I'm thinking about this in the context of the conversation we were just having about universities, where when you have Chinese graduate students coming and spending 6 years in a PhD program, acquiring lots of skills and knowledge, those skills and knowledge hopefully should be able to contribute to the local community, right? If you want to build a knowledge economy in Jacksonville, Florida, you want to be able to hire scientists trained at Florida universities to do it. If you have something like the Florida land ban law, where people can't imagine a future for themselves in that place because they cannot buy a house for their family, they're not going to stay, right? They're going to go and take their knowledge back to China, or they're going to take it to a third country. And so, I think whether we think about that in terms of the security implications of losing key scientific knowledge and training and what that means for the US, whether we think about that in terms of the economic implications for cities of their ability to build a highly skilled workforce, right, and keep people who often would like to stay. I think things like discriminatory laws, or the sense that anyone who talks to someone from China is then immediately going to be visited by the FBI or potentially targeted. Like, these feelings have created a real sense of fear and anxiety among the AAPI community. I think that can create challenges for security, where then those communities are less willing to do things like talk to the FBI or share information. And it means that people will leave. And so, I think that this in some ways is really crucial. It's an especially important issue maybe in cities that have a large Chinese heritage community like Los Angeles, but it's really something that's come up across all of our research sites as a real concern.
And I just want to add very quickly, I think that messaging and rhetoric matter hugely here. And there's been a kind of intellectually lazy way of talking about China threats. And I would even say that the current federal government talking line that the problem is not the Chinese people, it's the CCP, even that is an intellectually lazy and kind of dangerous shorthand, in the sense that, most Chinese nationals, many Chinese Americans who've even been here for, over a generation, have close ties to Chinese government or party state in some way. Many Americans do. They do business with China. They interact with China. They have university partnerships in China. Those are all party state linkages. We have to be much more careful about how we talk about where the real risks are, and reaffirm that there are real risks, but also do a lot more triage and really make sure we're not kind of flattening this discussion about the risk from China into something that's everywhere, and pretending that the risk of a sister city partnership is on par with a Salt Typhoon being inside U.S. telecoms. I mean, you can guess which one of those could really threaten American security, right? Yeah, it's a problem if local officials are engaging in corrupt business dealings, or if they're being persuaded to parrot CCP talking points on Taiwan. But which of these scenarios is really the bigger threat? Right now, we're talking about everything like it's equally threatening. I think we can make a strong national security case that is detrimental to U.S. security, to talk about these different types of risks using the same level of kind of panic and the same emotional tone. And we can do a lot more to say there really are risks. Let's get serious about addressing them. And hopefully, if those are addressed well, particularly if they're addressed well at the federal level to kind of preempt bad local policies at the state level, or state and local policies, and if they're addressed by a lot more dialogue and coordination of the type that we're talking about across cities and states, we can come up with smart ways that actually go kind of 80% of the way toward minimizing the biggest risks. And we're not going to get rid of all the risk without getting rid of all the reward, right?
Yeah, I want to, I like that comment. I want to also just say, I think what we're doing right now is part of the correction, which is that as academics at a think tank, we are providing a venue for a more objective discussion about the risks. We also can provide research on what are the risks and benefits of various types of engagement, whether it's in the EV sector or if it's at universities. And when you think about who else should be providing that kind of venue, you know, policymakers, the elected officials, they're just not willing to do it because it'll get politicized in the next election. So you don't see politicians at the state level talking publicly about investments that they have green-lighted because they don't want to get caught flat-footed, or companies, which are also in the case of investment, allowing and trying to court Chinese investment strategically. That's great, but they're not talking about it publicly. So I think the thing that we can do as academics and as think tanks is that we provide this venue where we can have these discussions in a more sort of objective, less emotional way.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's a very important point, and thank you. We're going to now open it up for Q&A with the audience. We'll go with the gentleman in the front first, please.
Mark Lerner, great discussion. But one thing I haven't heard discussed is, isn't one of our goals to have China become free? And don't we encourage that by exposing them to American life, American ideas, and American goods?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, just one thing that I would say here. I mean, so I think there was a, you know, I don't know if this was a fallacy or this was just a widely held belief, right? That more exposure to the U.S. would necessarily persuade, you know, Chinese people and leaders to want their society to look more like the U.S. I don't think most Chinese people want the U.S., you know, especially the current version of it, to be their future. But I think that interaction with the U.S. can, you know, really open people's experience, and it can create also, you know, lasting ties of at least, you know, human understanding and the ability to work together. And so, you know, we talk a lot about, okay, so people-to-people exchange often gets derided because it's on the Chinese side, it's not really people, right? Like when we have sister city relationships, it's a misunderstanding of U.S. officials to think that their counterparts on the Chinese side are grassroots organizations that represent, you know, the sentiment of Qingdao or Chengdu or some other Chinese city. They are organized by the party state. But the party state is so big and it has so many levels and so many different kinds of people, and actually people working within it, right? That there's still conversations that should be had and relationships that are worth having. And one of the reasons why China and Taiwan before it have done so much subnational outreach in the U.S. is because they also want to get to know people who are on their way up politically and give them a different kind of perspective on and different view of the country they're interacting with, right? So if we can reach more Chinese mayors who might, you know, be in the Politburo someday, and give them an experience of the U.S. that complicates the way they're thinking about it, and that leads them to think, well, maybe this is not, you know, the ultimate enemy of our system and its survival. That goes a long way, even if we're not cognitively persuading people to be more like us, which they may not want to be.
Lily.
Thank you for your fantastic research, Kyle and Sarah, and a great panel, Patty and Mary. So I realize that the focus of your research, Kyle and Sarah, has been on the U.S.-China relationship and subnational diplomacy in that context. But you did mention Taiwan. You mentioned the TSMC investment. I know that, you know, Phoenix has started trade partnerships with Seoul and Taipei. I'm wondering, in your conversations that you had as you were doing this research in Des Moines, Jacksonville, other cities, whether there was any discussion about cities and states being at the front line of a broader de-risking from China in the sense of developing alternative partnerships with other states and cities elsewhere in the world, in the educational realm, economic realm. I know the Truman Center's done great work showing a broad increase in subnational diplomacy overall.
Do you want to take that to start?
Sure. Yeah, I think that there is a lot of interest in, so I can mostly speak to the China side and the Taiwan side, and there certainly have been efforts to do things like, for instance, in the wake of the closure of the Confucius Institutes across the US, there's been a lot of interest in increasing educational partnerships with Taiwan. So the US-Taiwan Education Initiative is a kind of broad umbrella. A lot of states have signed memorandums of understanding with Taiwan under that to bring teachers from Taiwan to the US and vice versa, to create opportunities for students. So certainly, I think there are ways in which, as interaction with China has declined, cities and states are looking elsewhere. One of the challenges, though, is that I think there are limits to the degree to which cities can effectively de-risk or decouple from China. And so I think one of the things that's been sort of underlying some of the comments today is that in some cases there are no viable alternatives to China right now. And cities are either being forced by federal policy to stop buying particular things from China, or to decouple, or they just feel like politically it's unpalatable, but there's no real alternative. So the battery example is a good example, right? Where right now we could produce EV batteries in China and import them, or we could license the technology and make them here. But in either case, like, China is going to be involved in that process, right? And I think on a lot of energy technologies, there's just, and more broadly, like a lot of supply chains, it's impossible to completely take China out of them, right? And so I think cities and states would love to look for other partners, whether it's on FDI, educational partnerships, sister city partnerships. But in some cases, there isn't an obvious alternative to partnering with China. And so cities are sort of stuck figuring out, if we can't engage with China, we have this gap. What do we do now?
Yes, right here.
Hi, Jesse Bernstein. Today I'm being represented through the Truman National Security Project as a security fellow. And one question for the researchers. When you were doing your research in US cities, did you meet and talk with any of the diaspora communities, like the Uyghur community, Hong Kongers, people from Tibet, interested in their views? And one comment just on transnational repression. I think, I understand that it can be stigmatizing, kind of the risk and the response, the law enforcement response. But I think one thing that's lost often is that it's not just China, right? There's other governments that are actively engaged in transnational repression on the homeland: India, Middle Eastern countries, Turkey. And I think if we broaden the aperture a bit, then that can maybe minimize the risk and the stigmatization on the AAPI communities. And welcome your thoughts on that.
I'll say briefly that we have had the chance in the larger research project we're doing to engage with some of these groups, in particular, like Hong Kong, Hong Kong Americans, Hong Konger Americans, Hong Kong exiles. We haven't had a chance to talk to representatives of all the different groups you referred to. And I would say that by design, the way that we conducted this research, and this is what I hope is clear from the design of the research, is that we've focused on local stakeholders who had previously had some engagement with China. So that's not inclusive. By design, that was not inclusive of everybody in these communities. These risks are very real, and I think I appreciate your putting this also in a multinational perspective. This is not just a China threat. Mm-hmm. I think the scale and the sophistication of China's ability to conduct transnational harassment and intimidation of different types is far bigger. But obviously, what's happened recently in Canada and elsewhere in the world is really chilling when it comes to other governments resorting to these tactics. This comes down to I think, again, broadening. Like, I think what we have to say that is germane to your point is that the interface between local governments and state governments and these communities needs to be broadened. And it's possible that as you welcome more representatives of these different minority communities within the U.S. into the discussion, you will get some people who are state actors, who are masquerading as more genuine representatives of these communities, but you will also diversify the voices. And that's really important because clearly 10 years ago that was not happening, and that's led to some oversights, and it's allowed for the outsourcing of decisions about whom to engage with or whether to engage with on the Chinese side to groups that have a conflict of interest in some way. So, we're very much in favor of the idea that, lots of these different community members should be part of the discussion. Local governments need to have broader engagement, and the idea that there's a single political broker who can stand in for a larger community, which may or may not be an internally cohesive community itself, right? That's a problem.
I'll just add, or do you want to go ahead? Okay. On the transnational repression point, I think there's an important conversation to have, probably at the federal level, about the appropriate role for foreign actors within the U.S. in a variety of ways, right? So we're seeing at the state level a lot of versions of a land ban law. So Florida has the most extreme version by saying individual Chinese citizens can't purchase real estate, but lots of states have a version that bans Chinese ownership of agricultural land, Chinese ownership of land within X number of miles of critical infrastructure or a military base. In some cases, it's Chinese government-aligned actors. In some cases, it's any actors. I think there are reasonable conversations to have about whether foreign entities should be buying, land near a military base, but recognizing the fact that this is not a uniquely Chinese problem, but a broader question, whether it's about land sales, FDI, transnational repression. I think that's really important because these laws do get sort of mobilized in a very racialized way, where people assume that the threat is like Mr. Wong buying a house next door. And, the indications are that is not where the greatest threat lies, right? The greatest threat lies in cyber incursions, for instance. And so I think sort of thinking about what represents a real threat in a way that decouples it from individual people from a particular country and thinks about it more in terms of general principles is important.
And just one very quick point to add, and I'll be brief. On the policy side, right, there's more that the federal government clearly needs to do in deciding what constitutes a foreign mission in the United States and also what constitutes a foreign agent, right, or an agent of a foreign government. So there's still, I think, delay in overhauling FARA legislation, and that's something that really needs attention. And I think it's complicated because of, lobbying patterns at the federal level. What's happening now, because the federal government is not acting, we have states now acting. So Texas has just passed an executive order where it's going to use local and state law enforcement to go after people who are perceived as being foreign agents. That kind of approach is very, very dangerous because I don't think any state government or local government has the capacity to make that distinction. And so there's a possibility for gross abuse also of law enforcement authority. If we have better data on this at the federal level and can make more reasoned assessments that apply to all states, that will help preempt some very bad and dangerous policies happening at the state level, I'm afraid. Yeah.
Just on transnational repression in universities, I would say another way to destigmatize it too is to say there's something broader at American universities about academic freedom and free expression, particularly within classrooms. And American students have it's different in terms of when students report on each other for offensive comments and things like that. But it is a kind of similar dynamic that can happen. Chinese students criticizing each other, or worse, going on social media and saying somebody is not patriotic. But there are ways in which academics and university administrations should be having a broader conversation about freedom of expression that would also help with the transnational issue and destigmatizing.
We have time for one more question. I'm going to go to the lady in the front, please.
Thank you very much to all of the panelists. My last question is for all of you. Based on all of your field work and your experience, what are cities, if they're doing so, communicating with the federal government and advocating about the economic and social consequences of these restrictive federal policies?
Do you understand?
So I think one of the things that came out of our research is that there's probably not enough opportunities for that kind of communication, where there's just few channels for city representatives to indicate some of the problems that they're having, and not a ton of awareness on the part of federal actors of some of these sort of downstream consequences that are affecting cities.
Yeah, I mean, there are places where you have very concentrated interests that are like economic interests or communities that have ties to China, like in greater LA. There may be articulation of this, through Congress and congressional representation, and that's a helpful channel. But yeah, that really should not be the only channel. The kinds of issues that we're aware of, where local actors, including governments, universities, economic development organizations, are concerned, include things like establishing easier, flights between the U.S. and China. Expanding the number of flights, which is something that for understandable reasons, the U.S. government has been reluctant to quickly authorize more flights if Chinese carriers are going to get those routes rather than U.S. carriers, or if they're going to have an unfair advantage because they can fly over Russia and U.S. carriers can't. But these are the kinds of things that really matter for local communities, obviously. If it costs $7,000 to fly back and forth to China for people with family in China, for businesses that are exploring opportunities for students, that becomes prohibitive at some point. Another issue, now not as much of an issue, right, was the level 3 travel advisory from the State Department, which virtually every university that works with China was very concerned about. Some universities were taking it very literally because they didn't know how to interpret the threat. And so erring on the side of being conservative and not exposing themselves to liability and just saying, we're not going to send undergraduates to mainland China as long as there's a level 3 travel advisory, even if the sort of understanding among those who are within a particular circle is that arbitrary detentions have not been applied, to everybody. They have not been applied very much to probably the majority of white Americans traveling to China. But those kinds of issues become really difficult to parse for local governments. So they need clear federal guidance. They also want much clearer federal guidance around risks. They don't want the FBI to say these construction cranes or these gantry cranes in ports are a huge risk. Don't use them when there's no alternative. People want to know what the specific risks are and how they can be managed, not just to avoid something entirely.
And I'll just end with saying that I think, that is an important role that something like the subnational diplomacy unit at state can play, where because they're communicating with mayors and governors, that's a venue where they can hear about what's happening at the city level. But their capacity is really limited, right? So right now they can't talk to every city. They can't answer every question about engagement with China. So that's an important avenue of communication that I think probably needs to be expanded.
And just a plug for something that the University of Michigan and the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations did a couple of times so far, and Kyle and Sarah were involved, was to bring people from, at that point, mostly state-level governments, starting in 2019, to meet together, to be able to know each other, to network, to exchange information, to know best practices. I think that initiative was a really important one, and I think, and I hope that it will be continued, because I think that's what, a lot of it is also sharing information between states and cities in a way that is done much more easily in China because of the structure of their government, but is actually done not that well here. Thank you.
Great. Well, that was a really fantastic conversation. I just want to thank Kyle, Sarah, and Mary so much for enriching the discussion. Kyle and Sarah, I know there's a report that will be released based on your field study. I don't think it's available yet, but would you tell the audience how they might access more of your research for those who are interested?
Sure. So that white paper will be released by the Truman Center for National Policy in early 2025. So I would keep an eye on the Truman Center website as the best way to access that.
欢迎来到6度解析新闻背后的多维思考，带你洞悉头条背后的世界。在今日华尔街频道的6度解析中，我们将深入探究时事热点，为你揭开新闻背后的真相。在这个信息泛滥、真相难觅的时代，6度解析应运而生。我运用海量数据、人工智能整合以及专家观点，层层剥析每个故事，通过实时背景数据挖掘，确保你获得全面的新闻资讯。然而，我们关注的不仅仅是数据，更重要的是将它们串联起来。我将分析多方视角，揭示隐藏的脉络，为你提供单一媒体常常忽略的背景信息。无论是政治、经济还是全球事务，我都将为你带来最具洞察力的分析。试想一下，拥有洞悉全局的能力，做出明智的决策，参与有意义的讨论，这就是6度解析带给你的价值。它不仅仅是新闻分析，更是一种赋能的工具。加入今日华尔街的6度解析，共同探索头条背后的故事。你通往深度理解的旅程从这里开始。不要只是阅读新闻，要解码新闻，理解新闻，活出新闻。这一切尽在6度解析。立即订阅，不错过任何真知灼见。因为了解真相仅仅是个开始。